I got to clean up the interceptions. I put our defense in a bad spot on a couple occasions. And, it was just we've definitely lost some momentum, and, we didn't make the plays we needed to make. And I got to be better. It starts with me. I got to protect the ball, lead these guys better, and I'll own that.
The Eagles blew a 17-point blown lead, and the Washington football team gets the victory. Not the best game for Philly's leading man. Carson Wentz sacked 8 times by that Washington pass rush. Dan back here with us, who's had some epic battles with Max about Carson. Max, I'll start with you. What did this game say to you about Wentz?
Let me just say it like this. Dan Orlovsky, welcome. I've been waiting for you. I read your Twitter yesterday. I don't understand this. Dan Orlovsky breaks down tape, I think, better than anyone since John Gruden had his own show, right? I love the way you do it, Dan. You make stuff accessible to people like me, to everyone. And yet you have this blind spot or you have had a blind spot for Carson Wentz, because this was our basic argument the last couple years. And by the way, I was where you were a couple years ago. In 2017, I thought he was the MVP of the league when he got hurt. Molly used to argue it was Brady. I was saying, no, this Wentz. He can do things that a couple of guys can do. Like we talked about Mahomes and Aaron Rodgers. He has just about, maybe not quite, almost that kind of talent. So I get it. And that's the full Carson Wentz experience. You see this elite, like no ceiling kind of talent. Oh my God, he's amazing. Coupled with baffling decision-making and messing up kind of routine plays, especially at critical moments. So, like, take last year, for example. Okay, he didn't have his receivers were dropping a lot of balls. We know that. But he had 2 elite tight ends. He had an elite offensive line. He had an emerging star in Miles Sanders. He was in the worst division of all time. And he got healthy in terms of the numbers and the wins against the worst division ever. And every quarterback he played was either a replacement or a rookie, and everyone else in the division, which wasn't strong, did better against those teams than Wentz did. Like, I was not impressed last year, to tell you the truth. And why? Because of what we just saw yesterday. Early on, I'm like, okay, fine. It's year 5. This guy's finally playing up to the contract. He looks amazing. And then the decision-making starts, right? You're up 3 scores, you're heading into the half. You can't turn the ball over. You can't. You, just don't turn the ball over. And then later in the game, he makes baffling decisions, especially, by the way, if you've led the league in turnovers, in fumbles, over a time, just don't do that. That's got to be on your mind. It's the decision-making and also the execution of pedestrian plays. It was the same thing last year. He'd follow an oh my God highlight reel play with a couple of what? He couldn't execute that pedestrian play? What? He turned the ball over then? Fourth quarter, 3rd down, close games. They got lucky at the end. And by the way, he showed great spirit, but he was also lucky. One lucky yesterday. No, he wasn't. And by the way, these kind of mistakes he made, you can live with it on a rookie deal. This is why I thought when I talk about that contract, really? You want him to overcome whatever problems there are on the team? He's being paid that way. Can he? If it's a rookie deal and you have financial flexibility, fine, I get it. You'll take the good with the bad. He's in his 5th season. He's paid as a franchise quarterback. And he gives the game away. The Washington team was dead in the water. They did not have a pulse. He gave it to them with his decision-making, with his inability to execute simple stuff. This is year 5, Dan. He is not, as I said last year, he was not good last year. He has picked up where he left off. This is not, and I don't say this because I'm down on his talent. I'm very high on his talent. This is not acceptable.
Go ahead, Dan.
Stephen, I mirror you. All right. Listen, I'm not going to get into a ton last year. We know that you and I see last year very differently. You can't sit here and say that he's notorious for bad decision-making with the football as well either, because he's the first quarterback in the history of the NFL to have 3 straight seasons, 20-plus touchdowns, 7 or less interceptions. That is indicative of being really good with the football. Let's go to yesterday. Carson Wentz is the reason they lost that football game yesterday, okay? I am not going to overreact. It is week 1, but I was really disappointed in watching how he played and just the style of football yesterday, because last year he did such a good job of playing quarterback, understanding what was around him and what was necessary to win that football game. And yesterday was such a regression that it made me angry, to be honest with you. It made me frustrated to watch because when you go into that game, and I tweeted this out at like 11:30 yesterday morning when Lane Johnson was said to be inactive. The number one job that he had yesterday was to make sure that Washington's defensive line did not win the football game. Then you go up 17 donut. You're playing really well. In that moment, the only way Washington wins that game is you give them the ball or you let that defensive line get hot. And he did both of those. And Carson Wentz is too good of a player. He's too mature. He's too experienced. He walked this road last year to make those mistakes, to give Washington energy, to give them juice. And the play that frustrated me the most, and I put this on Twitter, was the second quarter sack when it's 2nd and 20 and they run a screen pass and it's not there and he decides to like try to make something and he runs in back into the line of scrimmage and gets hurt or almost gets hurt. It's the same play that he got hurt on in the playoffs last year. And so I'm not going to overreact. This is week 1. That being said, if he does not fix this today and moving forward into next week and he continues to hurt himself and the team, Doug Peterson's got to go, Carson, the next time this happens, you got to come off the field because I've got to know that you have definitively made this jump because the only reason Washington won yesterday was Carson gave them the game. And that's a lot for me to say. I still think he's a phenomenal player. I'll take him over a bunch of quarterbacks in the NFL. I'm excited to watch him week 2. But yesterday he failed himself and his team by selfish play.
Well, first of all, there's no arguing about how awful Carson Wentz looked yesterday. He looked absolutely awful. He was taking unnecessary chances. His interceptions were inexcusable. There's no question that he shouldn't have thrown the passes that he has thrown, taking the chances that he has taken. He's notorious for holding on to the football entirely too long. That had something to do with the 8 sacks. But I would ask y'all to pump the brakes and both of y'all just calm your nerves just a touch, okay? Number one, look at their right tackle. Look at their right guard. Look at their left tackle. You've got injuries all over the place. People who are hampered all over the place. You don't care, but I do, and I'm the one talking. So listen to this. Here's the reality of the situation. You had a questionable and highly suspect offensive line. They had 8 sacks. You could blame about 3 or 4 on Carson Wentz for holding on to the football. But again, y'all are shaking your head. I'm telling you, there's no excuse for yesterday. But let's not act like yesterday is always the case. Last year, Max, we're sitting there and we're acting like, Deshaun Jackson and Alshon Jeffrey and Nelson Aguilar at the time played all 16 games, along with Goddard and Zach Ertz, and he had all of his targets necessary to him. The offensive line was compromised yesterday. Their receivers missed at least 5 games. Deshaun Jackson actually ended up only playing 3 games the entire season. He got hurt the very second game of the season, so his deep threat was gone. We heard about Miles Sanders and Boston Scott and guys like that for the first time. We saw guys coming off the practice squad. We saw at least 3 or 4 games lost because of drop passes, like J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, okay? You got Greg Ward out there. You got a bunch of inexperienced dudes or dudes just are not considered to be that elite. I look at Carson Wentz yesterday, and I understand how awful he was. It was an awful performance on his part for 1 game. But I'm not going off of last year and saying last year he was god-awful. I'm looking at what he was working with last year. And if he didn't take some of the chances that he took and didn't do some of the things he did last year, they wouldn't have made the playoffs.
Stephen A., no one has it perfect. Last year, he had an elite offensive line, elite tight ends, and who cares if you've heard of Miles Sanders or not? He was an emerging star. Now, this, like yesterday, it's a makeshift line. I get it. The receiving core is better. It's not perfect. The fact of the matter is, with 6:29 in the third quarter at the Washington 22, he took a 13-yard sack. He does these things that are maddening, and that's why Howie Roseman, who I think saw what I saw last year, drafted a quarterback in the 2nd round, drafted Jalen Hurts instead of packaging the pick to move
inactive,
up
Max.
to get
Slow
the
down.
best receiver in the draft because they are looking at his possible replacement. And it's not just the injury concerns, guys. This is what it is. By the way, it is also, I have heard from a source that I trust, that one of Carson Wentz's issues, remember Stephen A., when everyone was talking about how Doug Peterson makes things simpler for Nick Foles, but it was too complicated for Carson Wentz? Carson Wentz calls a lot of his plays and changes a lot of plays. He has a lot of power on that team. And Dan, I think for a guy who has that decision-making ability, he probably shouldn't.
No, I totally disagree with that. Like he's one of, and I know people who worked very intimately with him. They rave about his intelligence. Now they've talked about sometimes he gets to the line of scrimmage and changes it when it's not necessarily needed because he's trying to hit the home run, and he tried to win the game every single play yesterday. Stephen A., you bring up fair points of the talent around him. I get all that. But you were playing the Washington football team. If this was they were playing the Saints or the Bucks, and yesterday happened, I would probably be sitting here going, guys, they were so decimated. But you get paid a lot of money, and you're good enough to know that when you get that 17-0 lead, you control who wins that football game as a quarterback. As long as you don't turn it over, and as long as you don't take those silly sacks, your team would win the game, because the only way Washington could score is if you give them some stuff, if you give them short fields. He hurt the football team. That's the bottom line. Do I think he's going to bounce back and be huge? 100%. But he's got to do it.
Dan Orlovsky, part of learning how to win an argument is actually listening to the argument being made against yours. Okay? I never disputed anything about yesterday. My point was about what Max brought up last year, about last year's team. And if I recall correctly, Dan Orlovsky, you and I were on the same side in that regard. We talked about him being bereft of the talent necessary last season. So what I was talking about with Carson Wentz now, there is no excuse for yesterday's performance. It was awful, and he lost the game for them as far as I'm concerned. What I was saying was Max can't use last year, piggyback off of last year to say, excuse me, what we saw yesterday was a continuation of last year.
That's
because
fair.
I don't think it was. I think last year was a different situation.
But wait a minute.
That's fair.
It was a different situation, but wait a minute. You're not going to admit, you guys aren't going to acknowledge, what was the real disagreement I was saying? No one disputes Carson Wentz's talent. I'm as high on his talent as anyone, I think. I was talking about decision-making and execution of pedestrian plays.
That's exactly what he did last year.
I just invented it. I thought I saw something. I didn't see, and then in week one we see the same thing.
Max, that's exactly what he did last year. Execute the pedestrian plays, and that's what watching yesterday makes it so maddening. Was he didn't allow the execution of the pedestrian play. He tried to do too much every single play. That's why last year was so different than yesterday.
Okay.
I see. So what I thought I saw then came true yesterday out of the blue.
Matt, it's week one.
Molly, Max, and Dan. So we all going to just sit up here and we going to point the finger at Carson Wentz, but we don't bring in Doug Peterson at all, who allows him the power to audible as much as he does, who sits up there and confers with them to run plays and what have you, who's the damn head coach. We don't bring up the fact that he's allowed him to go out there and play loosey-goosey and make those mistakes?
It's a fair point. He's got to wear some of that.
Yep, a total team effort. All right, here's what I know. They play the Rams next week. Rams looked good. That defense looked good, so it should be a good litmus test for those Eagles. Dan, I'm sure we'll continue to have this conversation. I just have a feeling you and Max will continue to discuss Carson Wentz. Just a hunch. We will see you on NFL Live, 4 p.m. Eastern today. Appreciate you. Oh, yeah. G-Men taking on Stephen A. Steelers. Oh, but how about this? Overbake, that's harsh. Does Baker deserve to get crushed after another loss?